Camille Gregor is back with another question. I want to dive into the paradoxical literature to see how it compares with the Gospels, especially short, self-contained Thaumata and Mark. Any ancient authors you'd recommend?
Phlegon of Trails. He's my favorite. He's hard to get a hold of, though. But there was a translation from somebody. Hold on. I have the book somewhere, and maybe I could follow up with a reference, but there is a translation that came out about 10 years ago by somebody. And it's a really good English translation of a paradoxographical text. So I would start there. But the whole idea of Thalma, I actually have an article coming out on this very, very shortly on how Thalma language functions in Mark. But my comparison there, I've done other work on paradoxography with Phlegon, but my other example is actually it's deployed by Virgil. And then I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with the work of Dennis MacDonald, who's talked about mimesis, but you have similar kinds of wonder tale telling going on in Homer. So I've had conversations with Dennis where he's like, why do you stop at Virgil? Go all the way back to Homer. But that Thalma language itself appears in Virgil. So I would say take a look at those texts if you want to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know Phlegon's not in Oxford because I probably would have had a copy by now, but here's one I found. Just the one you're ready? Oh, there we go.
It. Yeah, Hanson.
There you go, everyone.
It's Exeter. I was trying to remember the press. Yeah, University of Exeter Press. That is a great book. I carry that around everywhere. I had to interlibrary loan the original Greek, which was really, really, really difficult. And then it was the pandemic, and I was kind of hoping they'd forget so I could keep it because nobody had checked it out of the library since 1983. It's a whole story. Anyway, I had to give it back.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that Hanson got a hold of it, and
nice.
It's accessible. But it's a really good catalog. And then, I just handed in the final draft of my article on this. It's a book chapter. There's a edited volume coming out by Crossley and Keith called The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus. And my chapter is called City and Country. And what I argue is that you see a motif among many writers, both within paradoxography and again, someone like Virgil, where the further away you get from the city center, the more wondrous things can be, right? The more authors feel able to kind of speculate about wondrous things that take place. And so I talk about that Thalma motif in Mark specifically, because what you tend to see not only is the idea of like wonder workings happening, but Thalma, the idea of people being struck by wonder. What you see in Virgil, for example, I give the example of Camilla, where when she comes into the scene, everybody's dumbfounded and amazed. They can't process what they're seeing. And then she leaves and they're like, what was that? The language is exactly what you see in Mark, like what we call the messianic secret. So like Jesus comes into the scene, everybody's dumbfounded. They're awestruck. They don't understand what he just did. He walks away and they go, who was that? Right. So like that combination of like paradoxography as like a wondrous event that's cataloged by someone like Phlegon, but combined within that genre of storytelling that we see with the idea of miraculous figures. And I have a lot of different attributions for scholars who have talked about this Thalma motif in the past, including someone named James Townsend, who's a classicist, who originally wrote a piece on Virgil and the Thalma motif that I read that made me say like, oh my God, this is Mark, right?
That makes a lot of sense, because when you have a story and a certain scene in that story, for whatever reason, hits home for people like it, it's really popular, someone's going to come along and sort of, they're going to want to draw from that and sort of personalize it, put it into their story, and sort of try to hit that, like whatever that scene is or whatever that energy of that story is, I guess, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So, and the thing that it does as a literary motif is that it puts you in a position so that you relate to the people who are awestruck. It's sort of like, or awestruck. It becomes like it's indicating to you as a reader or as an audience member how you should react to this too, right? Like you should treat like this was so wondrous that nobody can process it. There's a word like a Thalma cognate word that like the actual like connotation of it is like people were so awestruck, they almost lost their minds, right? Like, so you should know, like, not only do you have eyewitnesses to these events, but they were so wondrous. These people are like so wigged out, like they can't even like process what they just saw. And so we have this idea, we call it the messianic secret of Mark, but it's really just a literary motif that goes all the way back to like, some of these catalogs of paradoxography, or even like famous writers like Virgil.
Thank you for that, Camille. Ted Francis says, do you think Paul's epistles are a form of a Platonic dialogue or a philosophical episode?
I wish they were. I think it would be so cool if it turns out that he like innovated on Platonic dialogue to the point we just have like one side of Socrates, right? I think that would be super cool. I think that there's too much of a tradition, and actually something I want to work on. So here's where like the limits of my knowledge, but it's occurred to me several times in the last year writing my second book. How much people were aware that their letters would circulate after they wrote them. Like sometimes I wonder, did Pliny know like his letters were going to be put into a collection and circulated later? Did Cicero know that people would circulate his letters? And so it's kind of one of those things I'm cataloging for myself to try to figure out, like how much was a letter private or public? And so even if we do understand that Paul was writing a letter to a specific ecclesia for specific needs, and it's one side of a conversation with philosophical content, was there still an understanding that this was crafted in a way, like not in the theological, again, that like German Romantic idea of like, it's going to circulate to all the churches and like, Turkey, right? But that these things would be preserved in certain ways to be scrutinized to the extent that they're scrutinized. And the reason I emphasize that is back to one of the first questions, is this idea of Platonism and Paul and the Gospels. Like I do see Paul as marrying Platonism and Judaism, but then again, I do think Mark read Paul. And so how did Mark get a hold of Paul, right? Like, because he doesn't end up writing like a Pauline gospel, right? Like he uses Paul to think about Stoicism, and then couple that with like a philosophical system and a story, a biography of this man, Jesus, right? So there's a lot of messy stuff going on here that makes me wonder about distribution models, publication in the ancient world, and how we need to continue to think about these things.
Thank you for that question. Wayne Wright, was John Logos in the first few verses of his prologue more in line with Jewish wisdom literature than like Proverbs 8 or Sirach 24? Or more Philo, like as far as the logos being pre-existing being?
I wonder how much we can divide those two things. If we assume that, educated Jewish thinkers in this period, or thinkers, say John wasn't Jewish, but he's, functioning within the parameters of thinking through the Septuagint, that language would have just been there. You know what I mean? And so I would say if I had to choose between the two, more so Philo, because that's more in line with what's going on intellectually, culturally, particularly within Judaism and the use of the Septuagint. But I'm not sure that they're mutually exclusive.
Wow, great question and great answer.
Super great question.
Henry Mars, thanks for the super chat. Authors of Mark use Homer, allegedly. Thoughts?
Yeah, this is something Dennis MacDonald has talked about. So I could just, thoughts. Hold on, there's an ambulance going by. Okay. So some thoughts on that are, I like Dennis's work a lot for a lot of reasons. I think he's onto something with mimesis. I may not agree with him in every single comparison. And I may want to narrow, as I just talked about in my Thalma Mark article or chapter that's coming out, that I want to nuance the parameters of literature that someone like Mark may have had access to. Like, can I get more specific, right? So I may want to add more to it. But again, I had a conversation with Dennis that is actually on YouTube, where he was saying, this idea of like the misrecognition of the returning hero, right? That's Homeric, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I see it as Thalma, but he sees it as a Homeric motif, right? So maybe we're both, like, who's to say an ancient reader wouldn't have heard both, again, resonances, right? Like, we don't have to, like, fight about which one is more right in that respect. What I'll say is this. one thing that sticks out to me about why I find Dennis's argument appealing beyond its obvious merits, which is back to this idea of like, let's get practical and historical about how people in the ancient world functionally became literate. Like when they went to school, what did they do, right? Like I'm always obsessed in my work with like, break it down to the practical aspects. Don't assume anything. Like, what do I know it took to go to school? How long did you have to go to school to be able to do X, Y, Z? What did you learn, from? And we know that Homer would have been, even in like basic schooling, possibly somebody that you would have like learned to even just figure, like write letters, like based on like a Homeric line, right, in school. So just think about like, my kid comes home these days, like just trying to repeat the alphabet, like trying to get his R's right. Like you might have given in, ancient school paideia, a line from Homer for somebody to like try to copy out. Sometimes we know they had homework assignments where you would be given a statement from, say, a Homeric text or Euripides or somebody like, now riff off of this and tell me how somebody would have answered this, or do like a character study on this character from Homer that doesn't get as, a complete treatment. Tell me what, like, I'll go back to Euripides for a second. Like, tell me what Jason would have said to Medea if they had continued the conversation like 5 years later. You see what I mean? Like you would give these homework assignments or like, in-class assignments to students in paideia that were often Homerically based. So I'm not too surprised then if I see resonances with Homer, with anybody who's writing, especially in Greek in the ancient world, because I just assume they would have been exposed to it at some point, like Shakespeare for us today, right? Like,
Yeah.
So, you've heard of Hamlet,
Yeah.
right? Like you've heard of Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
You probably can make, To Be or Not to Be. I've been obsessed with Philomena Kunk. So watch Philomena Kunk on Shakespeare if you know nothing else for like a primer. But like I have nothing to do with Shakespeare otherwise in my life. But I was like forced to recite sonnets at some point in English class, right?
Yeah.
So I remember some of that stuff. So, and I'm pretty sure I talked about Shakespeare at some point in the book. So like you can already now reconstruct my education a little bit. And it's that kind of principle I try to bring to the ancient world.
Thank you, Henry, for that. Shadman, thank you. Is James responding to the letters of Paul?
There's an argument to be made that anything 2nd century and later is responding. I mean, there's an argument to be made that everything is responding to the letters of Paul. I mean, let's just be honest.
Because
right?
in James, you get he's like, it's not just about faith, you ignoramus. It's also about works. And you can argue that he's like, because Paul has this idea that it's all about faith and that's all you need. And
but Paul, that gets over. That's interesting you bring that up. That gets so the whole faith versus works thing, that is very much a later Protestant interpretation, like a Lutheran specifically, but Protestant interpretation of Paul. That has a lot to do with our translations too. What Paul says is that it's not just like what we would translate as works alone or just the law alone, but it's also this idea of pistis, of faith. But he's not saying they're mutually exclusive either. Like sometimes people go into the direction of thinking like he's saying that the law is like useless or the law is a bad thing or he rejects the law. When he says the law is spiritual all the time, he just thinks it's a different covenant between God and the Jewish people. There's a different covenant for God and the Gentiles. But I think there's a good argument to be made that, like it is actually kind of, I think it's pushing the boundaries of where the field is at right now. But to say that Paul is the genesis of almost everything that we have, with the exception, I mean, at least the things that become what we would consider orthodox, right? Canonical things. Then yes, I think that's fair. And then otherwise, the only thing about that question I hesitate and I worry about is, do they mean the Jerusalem Council? Like, was James reading Paul's letters? Like, are we talking about James?
Yeah, because I don't think James really wrote James. I think we're all on that page, right?
Right. So that's the only thing I'm worried about. Is this I'm thinking not about James writing, but James the guy.
Yeah.
From the 1st century. So I just want to make sure I cover all the bases. I doubt James the dude, like in Jerusalem, read anything Paul wrote.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Thanks for the super chat. Camille Greger is with another
Hi
one.
again.
Some reviews of your book seem to think you posit that there were no Christian communities in the first century. Vital Lacleva Orhler, I can't read that. Can you please explain how this is not your position?
Camille, I love you. You're great. You know how this happened? There's a synopsis of my book that, like, you know, the little description. I didn't bring my book with me because I was trying to figure this out too. And it says that people may or may not have been Christian, like part of a Christian community who were involved in the writing of the Gospels. So I think sometimes people see that description and assume that I'm trying to argue the Gospels were not written by Christians. So let me nuance this a little bit. It's the description that's like in the inside. If you do the look inside the book, I think it's like the one.
Oh, you want to click it? Click it?
Yeah,
Okay.
click the inside of the book, and
First
then
one?
go. Yeah, this somewhere in there. Yeah, it's somewhere in there.
Want me to zoom in a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time with it, but I know it's there.
Oops.
Oh, I saw it. Wait.
There we go.
There it is. Persons who may or may not have been professed Christians. But the context is, so I say the Synoptic Gospels were written by elite cultural producers working within a dynamic cadre of literate specialists, including persons who may or may not have been professed Christians. What I mean by that is that you can have gospel authors because literacy is so unattainable for most people. Literacy rates are so low in antiquity. So, you know, at best, you could say 10, 15%, probably closer to like, you know, at the level of prose composition, like 4 to 5%, that whoever's writing these gospels might be circulating them within literary networks inspired by certain kinds of literature within a literate, you know, cultural producer, circle of literate cultural producers, some of whom may not be even Christian, right? So this is back to what we were saying before with Derek's question, are there communities behind these texts? Sure. If you're Mark, all right, let me just break it down with an example. If you're Mark, you are probably part of an ecclesia, right? This is where some of your information is certainly coming from. But as we've been talking about for the last hour or so, like Mark, I think, also knew Virgil, right? Mark also knew about the empty tomb motif. Mark also had been reading the letters of Paul. Mark had also been reading ancient biography. He's aware of other things, right? And so who's to say he's not circulating drafts of whatever he's writing, the Gospel of Mark, to people who are not Christians, right? Because it's that literary group is such a rarefied group of people literate enough to participate in the writing, exchange, and publication of texts. He could be exchanging with people who are writing on any number of topics, right? He could be have people in his literary circle. And that circle, by the way, can be disaggregated temporally, meaning like he could be reading stuff that from people who are long dead and incorporating that into his work. He could be, you know, like circulating portions to people who are in his literary network, maybe people he just went to school with who are themselves not Christians, right? And giving him feedback. Just because it's a topic that we associate today with Christianity does not mean that everybody involved in the circulation, publication, thought process, and, you know, writing of this text had to be Christian. But I never come out and say, you know what, I don't think any of these gospel authors were Christians at all. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
right. Yeah.
That to me would be kind of like forcing the issue too far in the other direction for me to start to try to claim.
I think it makes sense.
There's another argument, though, I should be clear, like we've been careful a little bit here, especially with Kloppenborg's work, right, to say like assemblies and ecclesia without saying church, or to say Jesus groups or Christ groups without saying Christians, because the earliest evidence we have for anyone using the name Christian, again, is in the 2nd century.
Right.
So, and that's outside of Christianity. Those are the letters of Pliny and Trajan. So it's quite late until you see that word. So by the time you have some of these writings, you know, would anybody call themselves a Christian? So that's another issue. So I was trying in that, I think that description that we just looked at is why that idea comes forward, that I'm making that claim. And I can totally understand that reading. I totally understand how someone reads it that way. But in the book, I nuance it quite a bit more to say, you know, like it's about these literary networks, which may have nothing to do with religion. Yeah, right?
God-fears.
Might have nothing to do with religion. It's an issue of terminology. I talk about this in the first chapter where I talk about Christian origins. Like how do we even know these people are using that word, right?
Right.
How do you know that they're only in that one group? We just don't. And so we need to have a more, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it needs to be more nuanced by being more expansive, meaning we just can't think about like by and for only communities. Because if we think that way, that's back to that German Romantic model. If we only think that way, then we're missing all kinds of cross references. I think it's really exciting to think that we might be able to scrutinize like different social strata for thinking about the production of these materials outside of that community model, because it hasn't really gotten us that far. Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but I want to make one more point. It hasn't gotten us that far to think about the gospel writers as communities. Markan community, Matthean community, Lucan community, Johannine community, right? Because you can make up anything. And that's what we've kind of seen. I'm not calling anybody out, but that's kind of what we've seen in the literature for 200 years, scholarly literature, which is, oh, well, the Matthean community must be, Jewish Christians who are angry at the synagogue and have been kicked out. And therefore, you know what I'm saying? Like you do this kind of like reverse reconstruction of like, well, Jesus gives this teaching, which is different from the way it is in this other gospel. Therefore, it must be what the community wanted to hear. So I'm going to reconstruct a historical situation for the community.
Right.
You see that all the time. People have a hard time doing it with Mark, but they're like, oh, this is mysterious. It seems like Jesus is grumpy. This is an eschatological group that thinks the world is going to end. And I just read this stuff and I'm like, but I don't know how. But again, like I'm trying to weave together some of the other questions here. Like, this is why Dennis MacDonald's work is interesting.
Yeah.
Because you can actually look at, well, what are they citing? Right? Or Richard Miller, right? Like, what motifs are they using? Or go back to paradoxography. Like, what are they, like, think about the way, like, Luke tells time, right? I'm just give you one more example.
Yep.
Luke tells time by citing the governor of Syria and talking about the Augustan census, neither which are correct. And so sometimes scholars will be like, oh, well, he's trying to bring secular time into heavenly time, and that's what. Paradoxography, if you're about to say somebody gave birth to a monkey, you're going to try to locate it in time, which is actually something Phlegon talks about. He's like, so-and-so gave birth to a monkey during the reign of so-and-so. Like you mark extraordinary events in time, even if it's not correct, by naming a ruler at the time in order to convince somebody what you're arguing is correct. Luke tells time the way paradoxographers tell time. And so it's that kind of thing that I think is more fruitful for us than trying to assume Christians, assume community, assume every topic, theme, motif, citation, everything in these gospels must be about the community desires, rather than about what writers tend to do, how they're exchanging texts, how they've been educated, what their cross-references are.
Wow, that was a great answer. Appreciate that. Thank you, Camille.
Thanks, Camille.
Soda Cabbage, cool name, by the way. Is there a biblical Greek, or do the ideas from your book support translating the Bible like other Greek from the time?
So, later manuscript traditions, especially as you have the institutionalization of Christianity, start to develop their own kind of like shorthand in Greek, so that you have like certain words that, like you can do like an X with a line over it, it means Christ and stuff like that. So I'm going to put that aside to acknowledge that there's something we might call biblical Greek. The Greek that we have in the New Testament is called Koine Greek. The word koine means common. And so what it is essentially is it's not the classicizing Greek that you get from like a Plato, but we know it's the kind of Greek that people going to school would have learned, or like Homer, right? It's the kind of Greek people in school would have learned. And the Koine is just a more, again, by common, just kind of a more accessible Greek. You can read Koine Greek if you've been trained in classical Greek. And I did the work in my own lab.
Wow.
I was a classics major in college. So I took classical Greek for 3 years, and I had like maxed out all the classes. And the reason I ended up here is because the classics professor was like, well, why don't you go learn Koine by reading the New Testament with the New Testament professor? Because there was like nothing else for me to take my senior year. And now here I am.
Wow.
And so it was easy for me to sit down and make sense of the Koine Greek. So it's not hard to do. There are definitely changes in like verb forms. There's changes to some degree in some of the language and structure, but it's not inaccessible. We've been making a few analogies in this conversation to try to help contextualize. This one is sloppy,
Sure.
but it's almost like you and I were talking about the founding fathers,
Yeah.
weren't we at some
Yeah.
point?
That was us. Yeah.
And like that kind of English, when you read, like, because I don't want to go all the way back to Shakespeare, but like when you read something like Victorian English, right? And some of this has to do with colonialization too. Like it's a very, very complicated topic, but when you read like old school English, you know the difference, right?
Right.
Like of a very kind of like high form
Thus
English.
saith thou.
Yeah, and I don't even want to go that far back, but yeah, like you can tell from Victorian writing the difference, right? One of the writers that I think kind of marks that I'm kind of you've all probably picked up, like I read broadly on like literacy and literature, and like I was talking about Arthur Miller a second ago, and so I try to think about these things broadly, and I look for trends in modernity that will help me understand antiquity. And so like Hemingway, before Hemingway, English was like impenetrably difficult, right? Like if you picked up a novel, it was incredibly difficult to weed through. And then Hemingway devised this very simple, short sentence structure, right? Like direct kind of writing. And that really sort of transformed writing in the 20th century in many ways.
Wow.
And it's that distinction that I'm trying to draw between accessible kind of common language. He used to brag like anybody with a high school education can read anything I've written, versus like Melville, right? Or like Forster. Like there's like levels of formality in language.
Yeah.
The biblical Greek is not written like that.
Wow. Thank you for that super chat. Great answer too. That made a lot of sense.